forgot to start it. Okay, so I'm gonna do a short. Let's start because we are already 3 minutes over. So I'll do a short introduction and then I will pass you the floor. Okay?
Certainly.
Well, thanks. So we start to. Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to another talk in our webinar series. This webinar is also being streamed live on YouTube. You can find the link on our website or you can access it on our YouTube channel, LIneA MCTI. Today, we have the honor of having Dr. Antonia Sierra who is a physics scientist working at the Argonne National Laboratory, focusing on using parallel processing-driven workflows to run end-to-end simulations on the supercomputing resources at the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility. Aside from these duties, she also develops research and cosmology with an emphasis on the subjects of dark matter halo modeling and matter power spectrum emulation. Dr. Sierra, thank you very much for being so kind and having accepted to give us a webinar talk today on such an exciting topic. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So, as has been said, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Argonne National Lab. And this is going to talk about a lot of my work that essentially just happened at the lab, which is extreme scale image simulation workflows for LSST DESC. And I promise I'll get into all the acronyms in a little bit. So I basically divided this talk into several big questions that I hope to answer by the end of this. The first is, what is the Vera Rubin Observatory LSST DESC Second Data Challenge Simulation Campaign, which is an extraordinarily long thing to say when it isn't full of acronyms, and I've still kept some of the acronyms. I'll talk about how we start from effectively nothing and end up generating simulated telescope quality images. How we turn this entire process, or at least the image simulation part, into a scalable and portable workflow that's designed to run on many different compute resources, which might have heterogeneous architectures. And also just what lessons can we take away from this going forward, which is perhaps particularly relevant as more of the computing needs of LSST science are being pushed into in-kind contributions and the like. So to start off, just what even is the Vera Rubin Observatory LSST Second Data Challenge? So for anyone who's done cosmology, I'm sure you've seen this slide a billion times, but I feel obligated to have it in any talk I give. So the cosmology community has settled on what we call a standard, in air quotes, cosmology, called lambda cold dark matter cosmology, or LCDM typically. This is a cosmology with dark energy, dark matter. It's the familiar one you've probably all heard about at least once. And it matches our observations very well. So we've done many experiments. We've measured observations of the universe to very high precision, and we've tried to fit cosmologies to it. And we can fit the LCDM model with 7 cosmological parameters amazingly well. And so the most famous example of that is probably to your right here. Well, maybe second most famous. One of the most famous examples of it is the Planck collaboration result, which is shown to the right here, where temperature fluctuations are shown against angular scale. And I assure you, there are error bars on every single one of those points. And despite only having 7 free parameters for this model, you can match that data precisely. And it's astonishing. It's a very complex function, obviously, and you would think that it might take naively maybe 10 parameters to fit 5 separate peaks incredibly well, but the model fits very well. So the downside to this is there are tensions, especially when we look in the early universe versus the late universe. We find differences in how we measure the Hubble constant. But there's also some smaller tensions in things like F sigma 8, which is essentially measuring structure formation over the history of the universe, and other small parameters like that. And so while it is a model that fits our universe very well, we want to study it more because even though we have a very good fit to our data, it's confusing. So the DC2 Image Simulation campaign is part of this effort. So the Villarreal Observatory LSST is going to be this massive undertaking. It's going to be observing 18,000 square degrees of the night sky over the course of 10 years, all in the southern skies primarily. And the Dark Energy Science Collaboration is one of the several science collaborations, and I believe the largest one still, which is seeking to use this exciting data that's going to be appearing to constrain cosmological parameters and understand the universe around us a bit more. It will be an unprecedented amount of data for cosmology. We're effectively talking about surveying the entire southern night sky once every 3 nights. And I should note that the entire survey will be significantly deeper, even at the wide, fast, deep field level, which is our shallowest part of the survey. Compared to a lot of surveys which are focused around being very deep and small area. So it's going to be just a massive step up for cosmology. And so now stepping back to our goals a little bit, we want to understand this. We have a model of the universe that has 68% of the universe dark energy, 27% dark matter, and 5% atoms that we actually have some idea what they're doing and can see. And so we have this invisible gravitational force, dark matter, invisible expansionary force, dark energy, that we just have no complete models for. And we would like to understand if this is just our cosmology being broken and that, we're missing something, versus dark matter and dark energy are things that physically are, things that we should be trying to find out how to model correctly. And understand as what they are, as opposed to just our observations are weird. So we have many probes to do this with LSST. We can do large-scale structure measurements, such as how oscillations in the early universe get trapped into time, and you get like special clustering of galaxies. We can use weak strong lensing to understand how the gravitational forces between us and a distant object are changing, and thus understand something about the evolution of the universe. We can use what are called standardizable candles of type 1a supernova, which essentially they all have a very similar explosion mechanism. And so you expect them to have a standard brightness, and you can tell how far away they are from that. Galaxy clusters, because structure formation is going to be very different depending on how your cosmology is defined. And so with all these probes, we hope to really be able to constrain cosmology very well. And the statistical error we expect to be driven down by LSST because, as I was saying, it's incredibly wide, it's incredibly deep. And because of that, it's just going to completely change our statistical errors on these measurements. We're just going to be in a whole new ballpark for that. The downside is our models aren't quite there yet. We have a lot of systematic errors we have to account for, be it to understand how we can remove these systematics from our data, how we can understand and quantify what error they might add to our measurements, or even just as simply as being able to marginalize over it and account for it in our measurements. And so we're going to have to do an enormous amount of work to understand systematics. And in order to do that, we do massive simulation campaigns. And the goal here is just the fact that, if we have data that looks like what we expect to get off of LSST, and it has some underlying real physics to it, then we can just run all of our all of our science pipelines and figure out, where do things break? Is everything working like we expect? Do we need to make improvements on something? Are we handling these systematics well? That sort of thing. And so our goal is to really design simulations that will allow this. Data challenge 2 is essentially the largest effort on this front. So previously we had some data challenge 1. It was a very small area. It was testing things. Data challenge 2 is a simulation that covers 300 square degrees of the night sky for 5 years of survey depth. So it's pretty deep, not as deep as the full LSST, but significant. And it's a large enough chunk on the night sky to allow us to do large-scale structure studies and cluster finders and those sort of things that require rare objects or significant scales. So the panel to your right shows the LSST footprint, colored by how deep it is. Brighter is deeper. And the teal region, that little square, is the cutout for the DC2 Image Simulation campaign. So that's a wide, fast, deep field component, which is that entire section highlighted, and also a deep drilling field component in order to enable transient studies. So this is things like supernovas, variability in quasars, that sort of thing. And we simulate this in all 6 color bands LSST is going to observe. So it's going to give us just everything we need. It's going to be essentially as though we pointed the telescope at the night sky for 5 years in one specific area. But we should note that area is pretty large even for surveys of the past. So it's wonderful. Okay, so that's the motivation behind all this. Now we're going to get into the infrastructure of all this. How do we go from basically nothing to telescope quality images? So it's a long and complicated journey. We start on this far left side with some cosmology. And so it doesn't actually matter what this cosmology really is, but we take some set of cosmological parameters, generate some initial conditions from it, and plug all of that information about the dark matter field into a numerical simulation code. And that n-body code will then just carry forward over time with gravity in order to generate a universe of dark matter that will look like what we expect most of our numerical simulations to look like. And as a result of that, you get out a couple of things. One, you can start to identify dark matter structures called halos, which halos are arbitrarily defined, but you can use them to basically make a connection between dark matter and galaxies. You can find out information about the hierarchical merger of these halos in our what are called merger trees. So you just watch how they merge over time to build bigger and bigger halos. And we can also track the particle data and information about the particle density field so that we can do various theory calculations on those as well. For example, you can calculate the excess surface density from halos and particle locations and then compare it against observation. So that's still all dark matter stuff. So we now have to apply a galaxy model. So we'll take in observational data from observational surveys and have some distribution of galaxy properties. And we'll plug it into a model that says, for each halo in our catalog, we need to put in, there's this chance of putting in a galaxy here. The galaxy should be distributed like this profile around a halo center, that sort of information. And so we essentially find a way to connect from only dark matter to the observables of our universe. And these models have to be very finely tuned. They're very expensive to run, but that's the work of other people who did a lot of work at Argonne and abroad. So out of this, you get an extragalactic galaxy catalog, which we then plug into, we save rather as a extragalactic object catalog that is accessible to anyone in DESC using what is an internal data reader called GCR in Python. And so for that, you can actually, even just from this step, you can do a huge amount of theory work because plenty of theorists like working with dark matter. We're used to it. We're used to simulations. You can do a lot of work with it. But for DESC, that's not quite enough. So we go to the next step, which is CatSim. This is a code which is going to take into account information about the telescope. So we then take in, we basically hit a database called Opsim, which has information about the observation strategy, of the telescope, so we can tell where the telescope will be pointing on each, second of each night. We can say for each pointing of the telescope, here are the objects that are going to be seen by the camera. And then we can also gather information about Milky Way stars to see which Milky Way stars will be intervening, spectral energy distribution so that we can model how colors will be for galaxies better. We can include things like dust so that we have, dust reddening. So all this information then gets plugged into this code, and out comes what are called instance and truth catalogs. The truth catalogs are just, this is what you expect to observe on the night sky, and we save that as a catalog that people can reference, again, in comparison to other products. And the instance catalog is actually for each pointing of the camera, which we'll call a visit. Here are all the objects that you need to, all the objects that you will find, and also here's the instructions for how you will simulate them in a code called Gaussium, which I will mention more of in a second. And so we now have a setup by which you can go through the entire simulation area and have telescope pointings that you just simulate for images. Which finally brings us to sort of our core application here. So this graph was from earlier in development when we were considering another code called FOSIM, which was used in Data Challenge 1. Data Challenge 2 was actually done entirely with a separate code called Imsim, which I will talk about more. But that code is basically taking image simulations, or sorry, these instance catalogs that I defined previously. You plug it in, and then I give it some list of sensors on the camera you want to simulate, and it just draws from that to that instance catalog, finds out for each sensor, what objects are you seeing? Do I have to draw them on the CCD? And then pushes out a fixed file. And so all of these image files that it outputs at the end of the day are equivalent to raw telescope data. And by equivalent, I mean entirely so. So the remainder of this diagram is actually essentially what you expect LSST project to be doing to your data products at the, or your images at the, before coming to you. So we run it through the DM stack, we make calibration products, we stack images together to get more depth. We make the color images so that we can have nice pretty pictures. We make a catalog of all the objects and their color, measured colors and measured shapes and such. And all of this is exactly like you might expect LSST project to do, which is great because now we can take these outputs, pass them to our scientists in DESC who are making science pipelines to run on real LSST data, and they can run on fake LSST data and hopefully be able to tell us if everything works or if there are problems. So that is the entire length of things, though I'm going to be talking mostly about this specific part, but it's a very massive effort that has taken many, many people. Ultimately, I would list them all, but we'd have to extend the talk by 10 minutes probably, as I tried to pronounce names. But there are about 90 authors on the DC2 paper. And if you would like full details of this effort, the paper is available on the archive. I've linked it here. Some particular things I do want to give for me personally, I'd like to thank the Imsim team for iterating on the software as we were running the software, because we would identify places where things would break or go slow, and we would pass it back to the team, and like within days, they would have us a new version to test. So it's been very back and forth with them. Similarly, I'll talk about more about Parcel in a bit, but their team worked exhaustively with us to make sure that our pipelines were able to run effectively on high performance computing resources, and that was very exciting. And of course, there is the entire DC2 team behind me, and honestly ahead of me. The team behind me had to do a lot of work to get inputs to me, sometimes multiple times, as we found downstream that we had to make adjustments. The upstream team, had to process images very quickly with limited data so we would know that everything is working. So they also had a lot of hard work to do. Very much team effort throughout. So the Imsim code itself So GALSIM is this open source software that simulates astronomical objects. You can go to GitHub, search GALSIM and download it. And Imsim is a Python code, which is basically a wrapper around GALSIM in a lot of ways, with some extra bells and whistles. So Imsim handles the pointing of the telescope, simulating lensing in dust, and simulation of extragalactic objects and stars. And a lot of these are handled by sending calls to GALSIM, and then GALSIM goes through some complex decision tree to find out what is the best computational method to draw these objects on the camera. And so the way Imsim does this is you point it for a single visit, give it a list of sensors, it simulates those sensors. That's how it's parallelized over. And so for each sensor, we end up simulating a single image. The panel on your right is just the LSST camera focal plane. Each of those gray boxes is one sensor, which I believe consists of 2 CCDs, if I remember correctly, but I have the memory of a goldfish sometimes. But that inset shows you just how much data we're simulating at the end of the day. So that little cutout of one sensor that's filled with more galaxies than you can count by hand easily, at least. That is ultimately a fraction of one sensor. And so we're trying to simulate 189 of those for every single pointing of the telescope for many thousands, many tens of thousands of visits. And so it's just an enormous amount of data to simulate, and we have to, get it done. So that brings us to our problem of scaling. Obviously, we can't just have a grad student running every single image simulation one by one on a computer. That would take forever and drive the grad student insane. So we have to use scaling. So we have a couple of steps that go into this process. Step one is we heavily use containers. And so this is driven by a couple of factors. The first is that the underlying software that we were using was very large, very complex, and constantly evolving. So the LSST software stack is at the very top because we need to call some things from that, like Opsim. That changes very frequently with weekly releases. Imsim itself was evolving as we were going through the project, as they were trying to speed up the code and make things work better, have less errors. And so you would have to update that as well. And Parcel was also evolving because the Parcel developers were working hard to try to introduce better executors and similar resources. And so we wanted something that could really package things together in a way that would give us some good reproducibility across many resources. And so that's the other part. Our resources were heterogeneous, or at least theoretically. In practice, we were a little lucky in that we ran on the National Energy Research Scientific Computing Center's CORI compute node and the Argonne Leadership Computing Facilities Theta work node. And these both happen to use Knights Landing processors. So they actually had a very similar computing architecture, but we were also looking into using things like the UK grid. So we wanted something that would be able to be moved around quickly. And even with compute resources having similar processors, you still have things like different container tools, you have different job submission sites, you have different Python repositories, different software stacks, that kind of thing. So our solution to handle this was we made a big Docker image at the end of the day that was basically compiled every time we changed it in a GitHub repository. And so this Docker container, we basically pass it everything to run Imsim, and we can pass the container an arbitrary command for Imsim, and it just runs it inside the container without having to worry about needing to sort out anything special with the software stack on the service. We just have to worry about where all the files are, which is easier. The reason we chose Docker over other options was it's very universally accepted. So Theta happens to use a code called Singularity for containerization, and NERSC happens to use Shifter. And each of the, rather than have different containers written for every single container tool, we can write one Docker container and have shifter and singularity change that container into something that a format that they can understand fine. And as far as we can tell, we suffered no losses in performance for that. Container itself, it looks much like you might expect a container to look like. It starts with some LSST software container that already exists with all the LSST stack information about it. And then we just add in additional software based on our specific needs for DC2 production, specifically tagged versions of these whenever we can. And so this allows us to just tag this container image as well and have very good reproducibility if we ever need to go back and check an earlier stage of production to make sure, is this result consistent with what we have at that setup, we can just pull the tagged container and run it again, which has actually come up a few times in the course of this with wanting to check various image simulation tools and make sure that bugs in later images were not transient. So it's been very helpful for us to be able to have everything in neat containers for that purpose. We also make heavy use of Parcel, which is a parallel scripting Python library, which I can highly recommend from personal use. So Parcel is just all Python. You have a Python script that's essentially your driver. And that script will start up worker processes on various compute resources, which I'll get into a little more detail about this in a little bit. But each of these processes is then waiting to hear from a task from the Parcel driver. And you can make these tasks by taking Python functions and arbitrary bash commands and defining them as Parcel apps. And every time one of these apps is then called by the Python script, the driver stores that as a task and then sends it out to available worker processes. The motivation behind using this came up pretty early in development, though this is actually a pretty recent plot. So the right panel shows the distribution of sensor runtimes for the deep drilling field, where the x-axis is in minutes. And you'll note that there's about a 10% spread in the sensor runtimes. So you have a pretty significant change from sensor to sensor about how long your code needs to run. This is actually worse for the wide, fast, deep field because the wide, fast, deep field actually is drawing more objects. The deep drilling field basically just draws the objects on top of those. And so as a result, the wide, fast, deep field takes more along the course of 10 hours. And so 10% of 10 hours tends to be about like 1 or 2 hours. And so different tasks might have very variable runtimes. And because this is essentially coming out of a very complex decision tree in Imsim to decide how to draw everything, it's very, very hard to know a priori. And so we wanted to have some sort of workflow, which if some of the compute nodes are finishing up their work early in a task, we can put in some new compute to be done and just keep everything rolling as much as possible for efficient compute. We don't want to have compute nodes that are sitting around doing nothing because we still get charged for them, obviously. So part of why I like Parcel so much is the way you use Parcel is actually very intuitive. So these are just random snippets of code just for ease of understanding. But you have two basic setups. You have Python apps, which are just a decorator around any arbitrary Python function. You just define what the executors are and some other arbitrary stuff you want, and wrap it around a Python command. And now every time that Python command is called, it will send it to the executor. In this case, it's the login node, but that can be some compute resource of your choice. We use this sort of setup heavily for pre-processing scripts, bundling scripts, archival scripts, that sort of information, things that we're basically just moving data around. It's very easy to write those commands into Python, and so we just made them Python apps, and Parcel would call them as necessary. We also have bash apps, which are just also a decorator, but what happens here is whatever your string is that you're returning is actually executed as a command at bash. So we use that to do things like download containers and launch containers. And so you can see here that it's actually just calling Python because my example is a little lazy. But in our practical case, we're calling whatever container tool we have on a service with some wrapper to decide what that is by some flags, telling it for this instance of the container, we want you to simulate this visit of the survey, and we want you to simulate these sensors, and that gets farmed out to a compute node. And so it makes it pretty straightforward to turn basically anything into a workflow that can be distributed on high performance computing resources. I should note this works for MPI processes as well. We didn't do anything that was MPI across multiple nodes, but obviously Imsim is, well, maybe not, I guess not obviously. Imsim is parallel processing as well on the per node level. So we still keep that with Parcel. We also have bundler scripts as another step of this process. So we have to balance a bunch of different needs that are showing up, mostly driven by memory use at the end of the day. So each container has its own memory footprint because it has the LSST stack and a whole lot of software in it. Then you have for each pointing of the telescope, you have each sensor can share some memory. And that's because they're all looking through the same night sky. And so rather than have the night sky simulated 189 times, you just simulate it once and let all the sensors share that information. Each sensor itself has its own memory footprint because it's drawing different objects simultaneously. You're just parallelizing over each sensor on the camera. And the sensor memory footprint actually varies quite a bit by the object being drawn. And that's ultimately because Parcel is trying to determine the best way to draw each object. Sorry, Imsim is trying to determine the best way to draw each object by doing a complex decision tree approach. And so one object, it might decide the best way to draw it onto the camera is by a Fourier transform approach, which is going to be very memory expensive. Another sensor, it might say, or another object, it might say the best way to draw this on the object is just like copy it from a snapshot. Another one, it might be ray tracing. And so each sensor can vary quite a bit with its memory use depending on what objects it happens to be drawing. So we have Python scripts that take this all into account. How many, just all of this information about how the memory use is based on our prototyping. It takes the architecture of the machine into account. And again, we can set this via various flags in our configuration files. And it just generates bundles of commands to be run as Parcel apps. And so it basically just goes for each visit, well, actually, for each compute node, I can fit this visit on it with this many sensors. And potentially, if there's not a lot of sensors in a visit, it can see if it can fit a second visit on a compute node. And then these commands are basically bundled. Parcel walks over them and runs them on every single compute node that becomes available to it. And you can store extra commands so that if a compute node finishes early, you can put in new work. The resulting workflow is this. So we have a Parcel driver. It starts with some directory of raw inputs we've told it to cycle through. And so it just cycles through all these inputs. It determines what sensors need to be drawn for each visit of the telescope and checks to see if work has already been done. And then just comes out with like a raw list of sensors and visits that need to be done. And so we then run our pre-processing script, which then turns this into, for each compute node you want to use, here is everything you can fit on it without running out of memory. Parcel will then submit a job request to compute resources, which you can tell it what system you're using, and it will just change, again, based on flags, because we've set it up that way. And also, so like for Corey, you'll send a Slurm request, and you'll have some job waiting for Slurm. Once the resource becomes available, workers are started up on the compute nodes and connected to the Parcel driver. And at this point, each worker will see that Parcel is waiting to assign tasks, grab a task from Parcel, and then just launch it up and start simulating Imsim for us. And if any worker finishes a container for any reason, it will cycle in new tasks from the list. There's some additional things you can set with the executor so that you give retries if something just dies on the compute node. You can potentially bar retries from a compute node if the compute node just seems to be broken. Things like that are also available. So it's a very powerful tool for scaling something like this up to high performance computing. And so from all of this, in 2 different compute resources, we can generate our survey. And so that gets us to final results finally. So we used 100 million compute hours overall, and up to 2,000 nodes on Cori and 4,000 nodes on Theta. So we're able to scale this up to, well, 4,000 nodes is basically all of Theta as far as anyone is concerned. There's always some subset of nodes that are flickering. So we can scale it up very, very, very large number of nodes. And we're able to simulate all 5 years of survey depth that we were hoping for. And there's already multiple DESC projects using these outputs from galaxy cluster finders to lensing kernels, trying to understand that. And while that work is very much ongoing, it'll be very exciting to see what sort of papers arise out of this. I'm pointing you to one, but they're still underway. So image simulation, I have to include some pretty pictures so we can see some unprocessed VFLATs and processed results of the same image. So this is really where you start to see that this is very telescope quality image. It even handles the fact that the CCDs all don't respond the same. And it captures really weird effects that actually had some of our eyeball team a little concerned at first. So you might notice this ringing effect. If you haven't done much work with thick CCDs and U-bands, thick CCDs? No, thin CCDs. Sorry, I'm not a telescope person anymore, so I sometimes mix this up. But if you go into U-band and longer wavelengths, you actually get these reflections as light kind of bounces off the CCD itself. And so you get these kind of tree ring effects. And so we actually freaked out people a bit, thinking something had gone horribly wrong for a bit when things have just actually went horribly right. So that was fun. So as I was saying, we have eyeballs to validate this. So this is our tool that we made to just validate via many, many eyeballs. So we had a tool that would just, bring up a random section of the processed image, or less processed in this case. You would be able to, click on areas you thought were problematic, submit it if it was, or just, skip and move along and say there was nothing wrong there. And so we were able to do this in order to go through an enormous amount of data for testing purposes. We actually made it a challenge in the LSST DESC community to see who could validate the most images at one point. I believe the prize was a t-shirt, but I might be misremembering. And we actually did find problems with it. So we did find areas that were over subtracted, for example, and then we were able to go back and correct that in the processing. Though I should note that was actually a problem with the stack set, stack level. So we were actually finding problems for LSST project. And so it was a very useful process for everyone involved. We can do quantitative validation of this all as well to make sure that we're getting something sane now. So the left panel is the absolute, the difference in the position in the truth catalog versus the position in the DC2 image catalog for some subset of objects. And so you can see that we have a very good control over objects appearing on the sky where we expect them to. There is some scatter. You kind of expect that on some level because it's light. It has some sort of inherent randomness to it. And you have CCD effects as well. But you can see that we can recover the positions without any sort of bias to it. And that's what we're worried about here. We also have on the right panel a number density case. So this is just number density of galaxies with some given R band magnitude. And so you can see in blue, the line is our input of Cosmo DC2. So this is basically just all theory. and orange is the DC2 Image Simulation campaign, and they match up very nicely until you start to get to very faint magnitudes. And so the Image Simulation campaign was very successful at sort of recovering that effect. We can compare it to observations as well. So this we don't expect to match up perfectly due to the fact that we are running it through a separate code to connect halos to galaxies. And even though it is tuned to observations, the simulation itself is not tuned to the observations. And so the distributions might be subtly different, or not so subtly in some cases. So the black line here is the SDSS surveys observations for their sample. Here, orange is Cosmo DC2, so it's the underlying data we told the image simulations to do. Green is what you infer from DC2 after processing it and measuring all of this after just literally processing all the scientific images. And so you can see we actually do recover the underlying DC2 inputs fairly well. There is a bit of mismatch here at some pretty extreme colors. But ultimately, for the most part, we recovered the data very well. So we should be, there's nothing here that suggests that we won't be able to do science with it. So that was all the DC2 results. So I just want to really quickly go, because I've been a little slow on the other parts, about harder lessons to go forward with. So the Parcel driver has to be run on a stable and persistent resource, and that had been a problem with us throughout the runs. Theta at Argonne Leadership Computing Facility, for example, has maintenance downtimes every second Monday. Corey sometimes spontaneously loses a node, which is never fun. And so in those cases, the Parcel driver is disconnected, and the workers, if they start up from the jobs, which they will still do because the job command tells them how to start it up, those workers will have nothing to connect to. The good news is the Parcel driver can be manually reconnected. The bad news is it's stuck on whoever's monitoring things, and if it's disconnected at an odd hour of the day and your job happens to start when the machine comes back up, let's say, at like 2 a.m. in the morning, then it's very awkward to wake up at 7 a.m. to a slew of emails about how are the computers not doing anything. So that happened once. That was not fun. Containers themselves, they work for us, but they might have unquantified costs that we should look into for the future. So this was very time sensitive running DC2, so we didn't have too much time to dive into these specifics. But you can imagine that you have a more generic Python installation. I believe the LSST stacks installation was designed around Haswell processors, for example. And so you're not sure how much you lose by going to not having the infrastructure-specific Python installs that a lot of these high-performance computing centers have in order to make the best use of their resources. So that's something we'll have to consider more in the future. It might not matter. It depends a lot on how your code is written, how it's vectorized. There's just a lot that goes into that. Container startup times matter a lot for the problem. In our case, if our code takes 10 hours to run, a minute to start up a container is not a problem. If you are worried about something like a Markov chain Monte Carlo approach, where you want to be redoing a calculation over and over again, millions of times, then you clearly care a lot more about a 1 minute startup time, especially if the calculation is relatively short as well. The memory footprint is also potentially a concern. I mean, each container has a memory footprint, and if you want to launch a lot of containers on a single compute node, that adds up. So it's something else to consider. And of course, the code itself that we used, we could find ways to improve upon it as well. So we were parallelizing by visit at the time, which results in slow sensors losing you compute time. That's driven by the fact that Parcel sees that it's just calling an Imsim container. And it waits until that entire container is done before putting in new work. It's not actually tracking the processes that, how many processes that Imsim container is currently using. And so if the container has, let's say, 30 sensors, and one sensor happens to be taking infinite time because it hit a bug, then Parcel will never replace the work on that node. It'll just keep going until you run out of time. And there are clear downsides to that. Sometimes you'll have compute nodes not using optimal amount of time, especially toward the end of a pointing of the camera. And this just ultimately, it's the fault, like aside from the bug issue that I brought up as the most blatant example, it's just a matter of sensors with more objects take longer to draw. And not every sensor on a camera will have the same objects. And so that could delay a node substantially. We do have potential improvements we've identified for each of these. With the Parcel driver issue, we could run it on cloud resources. Yadu Babuji is studying that quite a bit, where you can leverage multiple compute resources by having the Parcel driver running on something like Amazon Cloud. And you just, authenticate into your other compute resources and send the job submission request to them. And then just, work from there. The only downside that, the upside there is obviously that you can have work running from one master process on multiple compute resources. The downside is you have to be careful about how you're moving around input files to avoid having dead time. Because if you're moving the file as soon as the task starts, obviously you're going to lose some time as you transfer the file. Some of these files can be very large. And then you can also have sort of an issue with if you just put too many files down, then you're duplicating the entire data set on multiple compute resources. And if part of your goal is to reduce your storage footprint on facilities, that can backfire. I should note that another way to deal with this problem is a lot of high performance computing centers have been looking into workflow nodes, specifically to allow computing tools like this to be run on very stable resources that are, set aside for this purpose. There's container optimizations we could make. It's likely that we could set up something to pass in Python library information from the specific architectures. That would open you up to more risk that Python architecture specific library might be missing something that you need for the code. Things like Imsim tend to have very specific requirements of their dependencies, and maybe it takes a different version of Python or a different C compiler or that sort of thing. It's just something you have to worry about. So it reduces your ability to run on heterogeneous resources without extra work, but it might gain you enough speed to be worth it. So it's something to look into. And of course, there's code refactoring to consider for scaling purposes as well. So the Imsim development team is exploring leveraging GPUs. And as part of that, they've been looking into refactoring the code to simulate one sensor at a time rather than a whole visit at a time. So right now it draws the code launches for one visit, and each thread draws one sensor, one object at a time on that sensor. Instead, what might be a better approach that they've been considering is, what if Imsim drew one sensor and then each thread draws an object on that sensor? So your downside here is you're now duplicating the sky 189 times. Probably not a huge deal on a single compute node potentially. The upside is that if you draw the slowest objects first, then you're not going to have this issue with just hang-ups on late objects. And also just the fact that this might be more realistic because objects don't come onto our telescope cameras one object at a time. That would be very weird. So it gives you a little bit more realistic image. So what does the future bring for us? Still to be seen. Have to look into the crystal ball. So DESC members are using DC2 data products to validate their science pipelines as we speak. As I was saying, people are using it to look at everything from lensing to cluster counts to more. So it's been very exciting to see that in progress, though it is not on me to share it here today. Parcel itself is being explored for active use inside of LSST DESC. So we're interested in potentially having to do imagery processing for specific algorithms. So we're exploring how we might be able to use Parcel as a tool for running the image processing stack that I was talking about earlier. So there's some scientists working actively on that. We're also interested in it for theory pipelines as well. So we have a bunch of people looking into developing a code called SESI, which is a wrapper around Parcel with some extra rules to make sure that you don't do anything inconsistent with a theory calculation, but under the hood, it's still doing Parcel. And then I've been interested in doing some like developing science pipelines that run entirely in Parcel as well, from the state of observations to theory tests to Markov chain Monte Carlo approaches. So there's a lot of work that we can do with Parcel, and its ease in being accessible as a Python code has helped a lot toward that. It's unlikely we're going to make another simulation in DESC that is the size of DC2. However, smaller, more complex simulations may be needed. This is a thing that we are still talking about, and we're kind of just waiting to see until the science teams use DC2 and get back to us and say, no, we really need something like this before we invest into anything like that. For now, it seems like all we need differently is on the very, very theory end of things as opposed to the image simulation end. But it is something we have to think about. And the final thing I'm going to say, and oh God, I'm going over now. So the main advantage of DC2 for us in a lot of ways has turned out to be data serving. So we've had to deal with a lot of the problems that a lot of the IDAC teams are going to be dealing with going forward. So we've had to track a large amount of inputs and outputs with radically changing provenance across multiple compute sites and be able to track everything that goes in and everything that goes out. And where we failed, it was potentially disastrous. Complicated science workflow to document, it's many different steps. You have to understand each step very well. You need to keep track of what is going in at each step. And that's another thing that's going to have to be considered a lot. We actually had a couple cases during prototyping where people would accidentally apply the same correction to the data at multiple different steps. And so we would have overcorrections, which turned out to cause a lot of problems. So it's very hard to document these science pipelines when you're working with so many different people. And we kind of had that need hammered into us. We've explored the use of various database tools, Postgres and Apache Spark, for example, for data exploration. That's not my particular area of development, but if you read the DC2 image simulation paper I linked earlier, there is a section about how we're going to be using that for data serving of the outputs and allowing people to explore the data. And of course, we had to develop an internal Python-based reader to go through all these inputs and validate them. That's the GCR, and we basically had to make our own reader. So we've gotten a lot of sense for how we will handle this sort of serving up data to people. So it's been very helpful for us, and we're hoping that a lot of this will carry forward as other LSST desk members work on their in-kind contributions, where we're looking to leverage more compute resources outside of the United States and outside of France, I guess, because France is our other big computing center. But it's very active work still. It's something that's been changing very much in the last couple of years, and so it's exciting to see where we'll be going with this. And at this point, I'm a little over, but thank you all for listening. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to hear them now, or you can always send me an email and I'll respond as soon as possible.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sierra, for the very interesting talk. We now have some time for questions. If you joined us on YouTube, please post your questions in the comment section. And if you join us here on Zoom, please raise your hand. Luis, go ahead.
Hi, Antonia. Thank you very much for your talk. I don't think I'm going to send email. I think I'm going to invite you again for a chat because I have 1,000 questions around. Right now, because it's so late, let me ask you a couple of questions. Who are you talking about as a Parcel team? People from University of Chicago or already people from DM?
So I should be clear, LSST project is looking into different workflow tools for their own internal use. LSST DESC uses Parcel. There's a separation there. We primarily work with the developers at University of Chicago, Kyle Shard.
Okay,
yeah,
okay. That's what I
Ben
wanted to ask.
Clifford, Yadu Babuji,
Okay.
predominantly.
Yeah. The second question is you mentioned 100 million CPU hours. I imagine that is the whole thing overall. I mean, to actually generate the final 300 square degrees, how long did it take?
That was actually the 100 million hours.
Wow.
There's actually, there's some additional time that's not listed there, which was for prototyping.
Wow. So how many days was that?
So simulation, the average year probably took about 6 one-day runs or so on Cori. So this was an effort that took several months, ultimately.
Okay. Wow, incredible. Okay, congratulations, extremely useful. We are using DP0, we are using DC2 also, so it's fantastic. Thank you.
Glad to hear it.
We might invite you again, okay?
Surely.
All right.
Thank you, Luis. Parcel, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the lovely seminar and for all the work that you did to give us DC2. I mean, this is just incredible. I have a question regarding the systematics. So basically, you know, your intrinsic alignment, your photo-Z uncertainties, etc. So you actually do have that in DC2, right? Can you? Do you?
So I didn't write those inputs, so I'll say that first. So please take what I say with a grain of salt. It should be listed in the DC2 paper. I believe we have an internal intrinsic alignment model in this. I don't think we have photometric uncertainties on redshift. I think the intrinsic alignment model, I think that we had a lot of good agreement on at least roughly what we should do. The photometric redshifts, there's just been a lot of discussion on how the best way to handle that is. And I don't think we came quite to the consensus that people wanted at the time. There's been a lot of talk, for example, about wanting to hand out more information about the like for the outputs, rather than handling out just a color, to have a sort of distribution on the colors and such for getting photometric redshifts out of. But I don't know the current state of that in the Butler, which is serving out this.
Okay, thank you, because that wasn't very clear to me. Also, do you know anything about baryonic feedback, maybe? Because I usually work with cosmic shear, so I'm thinking, you know, about the systematics that are going to be important for me. So do you know about baryonic feedback as well?
Yeah, so the effects of baryonic feedback should be handled sort of, I'm not going to say subgrid, but it's kind of similar. When we go into the galaxy model, we take into account for, how baryonic feedback should be changing these distributions. And so it's trying to match onto observations, assuming that you've, you know, handled everything that would have been different from the dark matter only distribution to having baryons included. So the code L Galaxies, I believe it's called, off the top of my head, handles a lot of these things effectively. It's not quite the same as if you were taking dark matter halos and then applying some baryonic feedback corrections and then applying a galaxy model on top of that, but you sort of effectively capture it by thinking about how it will be affecting colors and that sort of distribution.
Okay, thanks. I won't hog you. I see Luis has another question. Thanks.
I have several. I just decided to ask a couple of them. I forgot a couple of them. How is the monitoring with Parcel? Because that was a big issue in the beginning. Now, and you said that you have to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning. So do they actually produce logs that are helpful for you? Or? So
there's been a lot of work on this. When we were doing DC2, these monitoring tools were not very mature at the time. Since then, there's been a lot of work to improve it. It's mostly at the Parcel task level. So it will tell you if a task has failed or it's succeeded, is it waiting to be run, that sort of information. And that can be very helpful on its own. It'll tell you how much computing resources it's using up as well, which has been very handy. When we ran the code, it was more bare bones. We had essentially when we started up a compute node, before our image simulation command, we actually have a bash command, which just forces it to
Hey, I'm here.
Basically, it forces it to just top every so many minutes, and we can just check the processing power and such.
A sort of a heartbeat.
Yeah, exactly. It was a heartbeat method. And then we just, have all these files outputting. We manually go check them if something's suspicious, and we can see if things happened. But
you also mentioned about changing, the image processing part, including Parcel. What is the M using currently in terms of parallelization?
I should remember this, but I actually don't. I'm sorry.
Okay.
They had considered Parcel. They decided to go with a different tool. I want to say it's Pegasus, but I might be wrong.
What about DESC? Are they using DESC by any chance? DASK?
I think they're going to be moving away from DESC.
Oh,
I think the goal is to move everything into this new tool, which I think is Pegasus, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, probably it's Pegasus. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. More questions? Well, I have one or two questions. You showed us that little part on the sky where transient simulations were being done. Suppose single epoch images. Do you plan or do you already include solar system objects in the simulations?
So I don't think we have solar system objects in our simulations. I think it's something we might have to consider more and more. I'm thinking, actually, sorry, I'm not thinking solar system so much as I'm thinking things going around the Earth right now.
Sure.
It's something that we would have to consider more, but it's not really where cosmologists are focused, so we kind of left them out.
Okay, my other question is more user related around Parcel. Does it make sense to use Parcel in a single node or in a memory shared machine?
So there is one major advantage to that, for me at least, which is Parcel has a built-in DAG, dicyclic graph thingy. I still don't know what that means, to be honest, but that's the word. So you can just set it some arbitrary complicated workflow that you need to be run, and just if you just call the final Parcel app, then it will basically go through and run every app that needs to be done ahead of it, allocating resources available to do so. And so potentially you could actually that could be useful if you need to set something like that up on a single node, particularly if you have a lot of very annoying to track steps. I haven't used it for any single node projects myself. I've always kind of been interested in, scaling up. But I could definitely see some use cases for that for complicated workflows where you just want to make sure everything runs fine. And it does have the advantage that then, you can port it into a scalable workflow. So it's very nice for prototyping from that standpoint.
Sure. Well, thank you. Okay, I think we can have a last question. Okay, if there are no more questions, we will now wrap this up. This presentation will be available on our website and on the YouTube channel. Thank you everyone for attending, and a special thanks to Dr. Sia. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been fun to give this talk.
Everyone, have a great day, stay safe, and I hope to see you all again in our next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.